friends. My name is Stephanie Romero, and I am the founder and executive director of Awaken Pittsburgh. I want to welcome you to our podcast, The Ripple Effect. Awaken Pittsburgh is a nonprofit dedicated to fostering well-being, empathy, and compassion for all by teaching and encouraging mindfulness and meditation practices. I also want to take a moment to let you know that Awaken Pittsburgh offers many other opportunities for practice and connection. For example, you can join our online community, which features a space to more deeply explore the topics we cover with our guests. We have weekly posts to spark thought, practice, and reflection. I hope you will come join us to explore, connect with others, and deepen your practice. You can find out more at awakenpittsburgh.org. Welcome to the Ripple Effect podcast. We are so excited this month to be covering the topic of welcoming, and our first guest to discuss this topic is Adam Paulisick. Adam is a serial entrepreneur and currently the CEO of skillbuilder.io, as well as a professor of entrepreneurship at Carnegie Mellon University. Prior to Adam founding skillbuilder.io and teaching at CMU, Adam was the Chief Product Officer at the Boston Consulting Group, resulting from the acquisition of Maya Design, and was a Senior Vice President at the Nielsen Company post the acquisition of BuzzMetrics, with global leadership roles based in the US and Europe. When not on campus, Adam spends his time as the chief researcher and instigator of Mad Labs, a do tank, not a think tank, that performs digital experiments, provides executive training, builds AI, ML, data products, and consults with both venture-backed and large multinational companies, bringing bold, audacious, and complex ideas, experiences, and technologies to market. Adam, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast. We're excited that you are here and that you are willing to have this conversation about welcoming.
Well, more than willing, Stephanie. Thanks so much for having us and shedding a little bit of a light on sort of the journey of entrepreneurship and how it aligns with this really critical topic of welcoming.
Awesome. So my first question for you is to just understand a little bit about the role of mindfulness in your life.
Well, let me offer two or a couple of at least, dimensions. So first and foremost, as just a human-shaped object, I think about my relationship with myself and everything around me on a nearly daily basis. Now, I'm sure there's windows like others listening have experienced where you think about less than you should, and sometimes there's windows where you think of yourself more than you should. But on a daily basis, I'm always asking myself, like, am I at peace? Do I find myself fulfilled? All right. And can I take inventory of the things that brought me joy today and ultimately process the things that were not? I think we extend that in the 360-degree tropes that we all experience. I happen to be a parent and a caregiver and a variety of roles in my personal life that sort of take on that crazy context switching between brother or dad or husband or partner or son, nearly evergreen. And so I think a lot about what my relationship is and that piece that I talked about earlier coming from within interacts with all those incredible but also chaotic elements of my life. And of course, hopefully we'll have a few minutes to talk about it today, the idea of what it's like to be a chief executive officer or an early stage employee of a venture backed or sort of high growth, high tech business. And where I think about mindfulness is this constant reality of change, right? We oftentimes hope for chaotic good. Sometimes we get chaotic neutral or chaotic bad in early stage business building. But I think a lot about what my relationship is then to my employees, my colleagues, my investors all throughout this journey. And then the last bucket around mindfulness, which is hopefully not exceptional to me, but maybe just emerging now, is my relationship with things like artificial intelligence. And as we think about a bigger bubble than just kind of human dynamics and systems that interact with me and cause me both incredible joy and, as we know, for technology, a little bit of frustration or challenge along the way. Sort of how am I going to think about mindfulness in terms of yelling into the void around my Alexa at my home now becoming the AI that is nearly ever present, around my office. So just a few ways that I'm starting to think about it.
Yeah, and do you have a regular practice besides I mean, what you said was beautiful, like the time to reflect about where you are in your life in relationship to being at peace, feeling fulfilled, finding joy or not. Like that practice alone, I think, is super powerful to just kind of notice what's going on in our chaotic lives. But is there any other practice that you regularly try to incorporate?
Yeah, probably a longer list than I should maybe admit, or maybe it's a good thing to admit it out loud. But I think there's two big elements that I think about every day. One is to sort of collect my gratitude at the end of the day. I think it is easy to organize and anchor on all the things that didn't get me to where I needed to go, as opposed to all the things that I did in an exceptional way. And in entrepreneurship, and I happen to build software, so all the things that people log into and browse around the internet, what that means is that sometimes things go really right and magic happens and artificial intelligence works and everybody rows in the same direction. And other times, it all goes really wrong. But in the absence of me sometimes getting it right, which is always the goal, stark kind of failure or stark kind of reset moments actually illuminate the bigger opportunity or the breakthrough moment or the milestone that I can now quantify. So there was a book that was out a number of years ago. I don't know if it's still circulating. It was one of those kind of airport lobby books called 59 Seconds. And it talked that of the many, many ways that you can have happiness kind of surface every day in your life, a simple way is to take only 3 minutes at the end of the day and journal on the moments that you felt the most distinct joy or kind of breakthrough. And so I still do that at least 3 days a week. So I don't get to it honestly every day because of the nature of the world. The other element is I spend a lot of time putting my feet on grass, and more importantly, my face away from screens. One of the important moments as, someone who is, working remote and then doing hybrid and still getting on planes and trains is to take small moments. So I use the bus a lot. Like I prefer to walk, I take the bus. I'm lucky enough to have alternative methods of transportation, but it's a means of me unchecking my body from all the cognition that's being stolen from around me, from stop signs to stoplights and all the craziness of this world. The other element I have is in the morning, and this is something I tell, most business people in my own practice to share, is that I don't touch my email until after I've sent my kids to school and I've had breakfast. And just the tension you feel from the moment you wake up, given that most of us have an alarm clock or at least some focus on that sort of small device that's sitting close to, now what's within 3 feet of us, 90% of the day, your phone. I really am disciplined about not letting myself get involved too early. And actually, the kind of lack of kind of dopamine that I'm getting creates this incredible kind of energy and this kind of creative bubble inside of me that wants to kind of release then in the morning, as opposed to, before I let it kind of burn up and get going, pull it together. The last thing that I would say, and this is perhaps the most important thing that I have learned to do specific to entrepreneurship, is what I call it, there is no neutral mindset. So, in any given day, a long time ago, a mentor of mine said, "Hey, there is no neutral. You can either do good or do bad. Take like or give life in every action with intention." And as someone who builds technology, it's easy to disintermediate that concept of doing harm or doing good from the people you serve, right? I'm lucky enough to have customers that are very active at Skill Builder, but the reality of it is that I'm not living with them every day, experiencing what they're experiencing. So I ask myself in the decisions I'm making, am I taking life or giving life? And everything from code to sort of my employee conduct expectations that I have. And that led me to a simple system, although, it's going to sound really frustrating to hear because it's so obvious, that I try not to absorb what happens to me as an entrepreneur. So as I receive what's happening in the day, I think a lot about like whether it's good or bad, how did I grow? And it wasn't until I could take the kind of worst lessons that I was feeling emotionally that were kind of negative or constructive in my life and the most positive additive moments or amplification. And regardless of what extreme that was, kind of convert it to growth. Now, some people will tell me that I'm taking some of the flavor out of life by not, riding the roller coaster of highs and lows. But in my profession, and I don't know if others will relate to this that are listening, I just can't ride that roller coaster every day. Entrepreneurship is, the greatest feelings of joy because you are such at the center and the foundation of what progress you make collectively with your team. It's also at the absolute devastating lows of feeling like you made promises and for good or bad, in or out of your control, they don't always come through. So those are some of the things that I think about every day, Stephanie.
I love this. So you are touching on this idea of welcoming in the way that you're talking about how you interact with your successes, your failures, your joys, your sorrows, right? This idea that we can make space for everything and then figure out kind of how to deal with it. The other kind of theme that I just want to pull out in case folks haven't really grasped it, because you shared a lot, is this idea of what's neutral, right? And so one idea is in our action, there's no neutral. And I just remember it brought to mind as you were talking, there's a gentleman by the name of Fleet Mall who was one of my meditation instructors and trained me in delivering mindfulness, actually. And he always said, circumstances are neutral, and
That's
that
right.
it's what we make of them, right? And how we kind of frame them that's not. So thinking about like that's aligning with what you're saying, but the interesting part of that is circumstances are neutral, but our actions aren't neutral. A
Well said.
little bit of a paradox there, I think, right?
Yeah, well, and also, we talk a lot. There's a couple of interesting kind of books and anecdotes about this concept of denial, right? There's a book that I read a while ago called People of the Lie. And it talks inherently about, this idea that, the circumstances can be tragic or traumatizing or unfortunate in all the ways that, mean that to whoever is reading or experiencing the situation, because we have to be careful, right? There's kind of an internal kind of reality and there's an externalized reality. And sort of there's that transition in between. And so it's important not to kind of shed judgment because small issues to one are sort of massive issues to other. And, you know, that's an important perspective here. But the construct that I was rebounding from and I'm really reacting to what, I think we're both saying is that there is no concept of not doing anything and being okay. In fact, if there was ever a time, right, to welcome sort of all the good and the bad, I think it's right now, right? I think, the eyes wide shut moment has to be over for a lot of us if we believe in things in like equity, but also if you believe things in significant resilience and growth. I think that, the ability to manage and kind of stay present even when things are really uncomfortable is a hard construct, right? And that's because, as as a scientist, that, rejection, getting rejected, whether it's, asking someone for a date or, demoing a product, travels effectively the same neural pathways as physical pain. And so when you ask someone to welcome kind of that with that emotional charge, right? So we always think about sort of, having to manage the things that kind of we use our hands for, but not necessarily our head and our hearts. And, in that same vein, we need to realize that there is this moment that has to come towards us. We have to stay present with our eyes open. And, the good news about our brains, just to kind of get into sort of the nerd kind of chemistry, right, is that in the same way, it normalizes the good to be less exciting, which means us to push. It also can normalize the bad if we allow ourselves to receive it in a moment that we are going to experience it anyway. And so I encourage people to sort of brace and welcome the challenge, the change, the critique, the frustration, because if you don't, right, it's only going to kind of compound and kind of find itself transforming into anger. And so a big philosophy I have of mine, which is not certainly mine or unique to me, is that a lot of people have a singular emotion that they allow themselves to kind of manifest other emotions as. And so, it was hard because I used to welcome frustration, welcome nervousness, welcome anxiety, and they'd all become anger because I didn't know how to separate them. I didn't know how to process them. I couldn't take them on my day to day as an entrepreneur. And so the other kind of big kind of guiding North Star I have is if I receive frustration, I expel frustration. If I receive anger, I expel anger. And I don't allow multiple emotions to kind of become these mutations of things that I don't know how to process or have to find unique ways to process every day. And instead, I slow them down. And a big part of welcoming is being able to control not the way that the circumstances happen to you, but how fast you react. And so I intermediate myself from that reflex or that kind of adrenaline soaked reaction that can, as you know, get pretty sharp and barbery, right? If you're not prepared to kind of react outward, especially on bad news, let alone even sometimes good, because callousness and ego and identity can be as damaging to those around you as, being particularly, misogynist or racist or sexist or all those really nasty negative things that we have. And so, a big part of it is also catching yourself. So, if you ever see me, doing that thing where, like you rub and trace the outside of your fingers or breathing from my diaphragm, it's not always because I'm mad or upset. It's because I might just need an extra couple of seconds to understand like what came at me. So I understand the right tool to kind of get rid of it and discharge.
Yeah, that's amazing. There was a lot there that I would love to like follow up on. One of the things, well, just briefly, is that control the reaction. We often talk about in the courses that we offer, learning to respond and not react,
Hmm.
right? So that
Well said.
pause that you're describing is like giving you choice actually in how you're going to respond instead of being kind of hijacked by an emotion.
Well, that's right, and, I think welcoming is a mirrored construct, right? So
Yeah.
you have to receive what the world has to have, and the other side of the equation, whether that's a singular person or no one or everyone, has to also be able to kind of welcome that kind of reverberance, and so, part of the tax you pay as an entrepreneur when you are the person who drives the economic outcomes you want is you don't get the benefit of just throwing a fit or taking your ball and going home, and there are ever-present power dynamics between, small companies selling to big companies or people with no money asking for money and all of the stuff that happens, and that's on top of all the normal human centered dynamics we normally face. So these are just some of the ways that we have to be honest, but admittedly it's not a particularly popular topic, Stephanie. It happens in entrepreneurship because the other side of that coin is it's expected to be chaotic and it's expected to be messy. And I think that's actually an important dimension for the entrepreneurs that are listening or people that want to be an entrepreneur someday. The reality of it is that you're going to get told that your whole identity is based on how much you don't complain and how much you don't process. And in part, there is some merit to that. The reality of it is that being vulnerable is a little bit of a dual-edged sword when it comes to capitalism, right? Inherently it is probably your biggest unlock if done effectively and probably your messiest disabler of momentum, right? If it can't be received in the way that you want someone to hear it, which is growth.
Right, exactly. And I feel like myself as a leader in the nonprofit realm, that's my daily life. You write a grant, you don't get a grant. This it's just daily life in the world of leading an organization. Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. And it really is just part of it. And you have to learn how to just receive and be like, okay, next, you know.
Yeah. Well, and in many times, I mean, whether interestingly enough, you use the same sort of tactics, whether you're negotiating a big deal or negotiating a spicy day with an employee or a colleague or a boss, which is you have to kind of meet them where they are, right? Receive
Right.
what they have. And you have to think in terms of root cause.
Yeah.
One of the tricks to an entrepreneur is understanding the why that is deeply driving or urgently creating a sense of, tension or anxiety or intensity by any emotion. And recognizing that, if the root cause is someone had a tragic event in their relationship, like they've separated, or a really joyous one where they've come together, they've been lucky enough to have a child, or unfortunately they have, moved into a new role. These are all big momentous moments that just throw off our mental models for windows of time that we have to be realistic about. Because pretending that everyone's going to academically be on the norm or the average or even the median of where we are is unrealistic because everything is actually average from 10 and 1 in entrepreneurship. It's rarely 4 and 6 on that same scale.
Yeah, the thing that you're naming there is, I think what we often talk about is positive stress. So we can all kind of name, oh, like something bad happened, someone passed away, there was a divorce, and that's really stressful. And we kind of give people space for that. But sometimes those big life events that are really positive also kind of impact us in ways where we show up differently. So I thank you for naming that because we often think, oh, we need to really work on welcoming the difficult, but sometimes the positive also needs to be able to have more space.
Well, and in fact, in entrepreneurship, that's the bigger demon that you fight. So as an early stage
Right?
CEO, she or they are going out there and telling a big vision, right? A story tale. And so in what they call the pre-seed phase, which is kind of in that era where you have a big idea and you kind of sparked with something, but you're not really sure exactly how it's going to land. So pretty early stage company, right? Like typically single digit employees, kind of early days on average. You find yourself in a place where you have to talk about yourself constantly, right? Because you're raising on a hype cycle. And then you raise on raising. And then you talk about the fact that you raised and that you're an underserved entrepreneur or you're a first time this or you're whatever that. It's all about the character, the brand of the team or the spark of the idea because that's all you have. You don't have a solution yet in the process. And unfortunately, Stephanie, I can't tell you how many early stage company leaders of all flavors, industries, and geographies get addicted to hearing about themselves. And in the same regard that you'd think that the negative news would be the disabler, it's actually the addiction to the superficial positive news that becomes actually their single biggest disabler of progress.
Wow, that's actually so fascinating. I never I really never thought of it like that. And you're kind of describing my life, except I got to a point where like I just didn't want to hear myself anymore. You
Mhm.
know what I mean? Like it
I do.
gets a little old. Like, can somebody else do the pitch? Can somebody, because it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of stamina to just keep repeating, I Awake in Pittsburgh is now in year 7, right?
Wow.
So we're not brand new anymore. And so there is kind of a moment where I'm just like, ugh, do I have to do it again? And
That's
and that's the role, right? That's the role,
right.
is to keep moving it forward. But I can see where the ego would really get big in that situation, and it would be kind of addictive to keep at it. I'm feeling grateful that wasn't my experience, but also it takes some stamina to keep at it.
That's right. Well,
It
and
really
it's and in
does.
entrepreneurship, it's a recycled life stage moment. So every couple of years, law of averages, at least if you're doing high tech, high growth, right? The expectation is that you're taking in an amount of money to return at a multiple of that, right? You're taking in more resources to grow at a multiple of that investment. And that means that, every 2 years, someone who has been praised or ideally kind of having a bunch of success has to reboot their ego and kind of cleanse that and let the kind of death of it all happen just to go back to those early days where they act in earnest and can receive, again, that next level of judgment and feedback, even if they, on their other side of their body, are being praised by employees or legacy investors or the market. And it's actually that tension that is like unique to entrepreneurship because every 2 years, especially in high tech, high growth, let alone what sort of the main street businesses and small businesses and service businesses have. It's constantly being reset because if you're growing, you're asking for resources that are typically above and beyond the resources you have.
And now, let's take a pause to update you on some upcoming events from Awaken Pittsburgh.
This Saturday, March 9th at 8:30 a.m., Awaken Pittsburgh invites you to a morning of connection and tranquility at our open meditation session. Whether you're seeking peace, community, or a moment to simply breathe, our doors are open to everyone. No experience, no problem. Our guided meditations are designed for all, from beginners to seasoned practitioners. Join us for a journey inward with introductions, a period of guided meditation, and the opportunity to share and discuss your experiences. It's a chance to support and learn from one another in a welcoming environment. Awaken Pittsburgh's meditation sessions are a gift to the community, free of charge, though donations are warmly appreciated to support our work. Awaken Pittsburgh's Saturday Open Meditation. Peace, community, connection. We hope to see you there.
Now, back to our conversation. Okay, this is so fruitful, this conversation. I'm loving it. There is one thing that you mentioned that I want to kind of follow up on. You were talking about if you take in frustration or you take in a strong emotion, that you want to expel that emotion. Tell me what that looks like to you. What does that
Yeah.
mean?
Well, it's interesting, right? So as a parent first, you realize that you have to absorb like what you are given in the environment, right? So, it's not happening to you, but it's certainly happening around you. But as a parent, you certainly feel like it's happening to you, right? If you are biologically linked or feel otherwise obligated to, whether you're caregiving or you have dependence by any flavor of what that means. The reality though is, if you have someone, whether it's an employee, a child, not to say that they are synonyms of each other, right? You have to be open to sort of meeting them where they are, right? So it doesn't matter that I think this is a big or a small problem. This is a lot or little money. This is a big or small emotion, right? It's the perspective that someone has to have. And so I have to absorb it at the perception of the scale that someone also perceives it to build psychological safety and trust. If I diminish or minimize, right, someone coming to me, whether it's a personal or professional issue, in my body language and my breathing patterns and my posture, right, even before I use the words to do that kind of challenging thing, then inherently, one, our trust is decaying and my half life has been apex. And the reality as well is that they are just going to be less open and forceful and messy with communicating, which means we are now in a longer window of processing. So I intentionally kind of open up and big heart, big chest kind of moments. It's like, cool, lay it on me, right? Then I have to kind of process, but the way I process, especially when it's somebody else, is to ask them to kind of guide me as a teacher, at least the first couple of times that we're experiencing that exchange together. So, hey, could you tell me a little bit more about like why this particular moment in time was impactful to you? Hey, can you tell me a little bit about what you're feeling you're making a trade-off for about, where you're trying to go or your life ambition or life that's causing pressure cooking? Hey, is this the first time you have felt this way? Are the types of exploratory kind of open questions that we often will have before I try to jump to solutioning. So the kind of pause and temperament you have to have as a leader of an early stage company is to not see a problem, solve a problem so compulsively that no one ever else learns how to, do the fishing or solve the problem. So all of that is kind of the first step to then kind of the discharging. And then basically there's a couple of buckets that I discharge, right? So one of the ways I can just discharge is I just have to live with it. I just have to let it fade and come through me. And on a personal note, I find grief to be one of those types of emotions where it's on a slow drip. It's going to be filtered like water through aquifers, and you're going to ultimately have good and bad kind of temperature fluctuation in a broader range, because when you're unfortunate in a circumstance where someone has been taken from you, or you have experienced loss in whatever way that means to you, which, because we know that you can experience lots of loss when someone's still very much living or even present around you, it's important to let it process in that bucket. So it just kind of sits. I think the next bucket is taking off the sharp edges for me. So if I'm not capable of fully just kind of getting it out of my body, which I'll talk about in a second, and I don't feel like it needs to sit with me, I kind of do something in the vein of the 80-20. I said, okay, like what's the real thing that's really nagging at me so that I can tame this monster, right? As you talk about in cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Like bring it from the monster outside the room, kind of make it your ugly pet inside the room kind of model. And for me, that means sometimes seeing it, visualizing it. Sometimes that means talking to other people in order to like discharge, the kind of risk that I can't see or the expertise I don't have. And then, and then finally is like the kind of full on release. And so, I'll give you a funny kind of way of time tracking. So, everyone will ask you as an entrepreneur how you manage to process the insane amount of emails you get. Sometimes you're sending, sometimes you're receiving. And so, for another day or for another style of podcast or expression, maybe we could talk about time management. But I have this simple rule, and it goes like this. When I open up my inbox twice a day, I block it in about 30-minute increments, maybe 45. That's the only time I try to touch my email with intention. I do three things when I see my email. One, I either immediately delete it. Now, this is going to sound really cruel, but about 80% of the email I get, I don't read, I just delete. Because I ask myself, like, does this improve my long-term success or the impact on society? And if the answer is no, or someone's extractive or entitled or whatever, I just like live with the consequences, like not having it again. If they follow up, we follow up. The second way I can do it is I can bring it in, and if it takes less than 5 minutes, I just do it. And then if it takes more than 5 minutes, I drag that little email over to my calendar, right? And I organize it with a block of time, and I let my calendar be my boss for my future, and I don't carry that charge. And that's some of the ways that actually metaphorically, if you imagine the inbox of my life, which is sometimes involuntary as well, who comes in and puts messages in it, very similar. First thing I ask myself in a conversation, right, is, am I going to engage this? And I give myself permission to just say no. Because I want to fix everything in the world, but I can't. I don't have enough money, time, resources, skills, credibility, whatever the factor is, I don't have it. The second thing I say is when I want to discharge, can I fix this in 5 minutes and take the rough edges off? Or finally, I say, hey, do I need to allocate time to really discharge this in the future? And that's some of the ways that I think about kind of processing. What that looks like and sounds like is sentences like, hey, Stephanie, thanks so much for bringing this to my attention. I just don't have the bandwidth or the expertise to engage on this. Do you need help brainstorming other ways for you to process this? Right? That's one way to kind of superficially discharge. Another way is to say, hey, you gave me a lot here, and it sounds like there's a lot of small and medium things that are feeling really big. Can you help me identify the three biggest, knowing that it sounds like we have a little bit of a journey or a pathway to walk together, but we got to start somewhere. So what's the stuff that's really driving you crazy? Right? Which allows you to kind of build the acceptance that you're not dismissing the 80% you can't manage today, but still focus on the 20. And then, obviously, if you're lucky enough where someone comes to you with a big thing, a big idea, right, both positive or constructive, you say, hey, this is a really important thing to me, but I'm not in the headspace right now to do this, which means I can't partially process and carry this between now and Thursday. Can we just meet on Thursday for an hour and do this? And there's infinite kind of variations of the ways you can kind of manage those dynamics, but that's some of the way that I allow my system to let go of that moment, because otherwise, the funny expression in entrepreneurship, right, is you're not actually better at spinning plates than everyone else. You're just better at letting majority of those plates break. And that is like the truest, honest moment you have to have as a leader, because I am not better than you or anyone else that's listening to this. I'm not honestly within 10% of everyone's range. The reality of it is, though, is that I am really good at being like, yeah, it broke, and I'll have to like talk and tell somebody that it broke in the future state, but more often than not, no one asks if the plate broke. They only ask about the plates that I was really spinning at the end, because those are the important things that I was prioritizing.
I feel like you have just given um, a really beautiful kind of metaphorical way to look at welcoming with the plates breaking. Like you are welcoming all of those experiences and just allowing them to be instead of the plates are spinning, you break a few and you can't hold it, right? And then all of the plates fall because you are
That's
just so
right.
distraught because these three fell or whatever it is. So the idea of just allowing, right? Allowing the natural process of some are going to fall, and that's what it is, right? Some emails aren't going to get answered, and that's what it is.
That's
Some
right.
conversations aren't going to go well, and that's what it is, right? That's just allowing, which for me is like the flip of welcoming, right? So you just set that welcome mat out and just allow the things to cross the threshold as they will.
That's right. I mean, at the end of the day, right, the challenge with being an entrepreneur is that you are a bit of an opportunist. People will say it more eloquently than that, but you're trying to preserve optionality, you're trying to move in ways and places and spaces until you can get more structured and more consistent and persistent, right? So, you grow transformatively, right, until the point you start to grow in an adjacent manner until you start to then grow your core. And then your core kind of fatigues, right? And then you have to grow transformationally, right? And then grow adjacent and then grow core. And that's gonna happen again and again, but there is no control, like, it's an illusion, right? You cannot without maximum privilege, status and resources, right? You cannot dictate even a minor amount of pieces, and so you see, for those kind of following along the audiobook version of this, there's a speck somewhere on a big canvas that's like, you. There's a 20% boundary around that, which is the radius of what you control, and that's, like, the maximum distance that you're exerting outward. Everything else is inbound, and so, you're better off trying to elevate your perspective and receive it right from an advantaged position than you are trying to like crawl through it and pioneer in every direction all the time. Cause we all know how that fairy tale ends.
Yeah, it's very real. The control that we exert out on the world is very limited. And the flip of that, kind of what you've been describing, is the control that we can exert in our internal world is greater than sometimes we do. And
Well said.
I love that you are kind of talking about that discharging of emotion as a dialogue, right? The way that you were framing it, it sounds like you're dialoguing with yourself. And I think that that's a really beautiful way. I just think of that kind of as meditation. When I meditate, I see those thoughts coming and I kind of dialogue with myself and decide, like, do I want to follow that thought or do I want to return to the focus on my breathing or my body or whatever I was trying to place attention on? And that internal dialogue, once we make it fully conscious, then we can kind of decide, how do I want to hold my frustration? What do I
That's
want to
right.
do with it? And I also love that you named grief as something that needs time, because I think our culture, everything is expected to be kind of one and done. You did it, been there, done that. And that's not how emotions always work. They come up, they settle, then they come up again. And then maybe they settle again, or maybe they're there for a long while. There's a teacher that I heard, Thich Nhat Hanh, who would say you could invite your anger for a cup of tea, right?
That's right.
You could invite whatever that difficulty is to come have a cup of tea with you. And that's kind of, I feel, that welcoming aspect with grief is you can invite your grief to have a cup of tea. And then, maybe in 2, 3 weeks, 2, 3 months, you're going to need to do it again.
Yeah. Well, and I will preface this by saying I have absolutely no idea what it's actually like to give birth, and I can't imagine the minor miracle that all parties involved, biologically speaking, have to endure. So I would say that this is certainly not an analogy. But what I have heard from others is having an early stage company sort of resembles a level of kind of extensive emotional, physical, mental commitment, right? That it takes to kind of create anything of a significant joy. And then, in the economic and professional sense, certainly not to make light of the physical sense, right? You do oftentimes birth a company, and therefore, if the company does not make it or people don't love your company, right, you experience loss, even if it's not grief. And professional loss is something that is oftentimes diminished and minimalized, but it becomes the disabler then of really effective leaders because they don't see that they learned and they grew in that moment. They see that they disappointed and they frustrated and they embarrassed. others. And that's such a point of view that you can, as you've already said, Stephanie, control in ways that we don't receive. Like certainly the universe is going to send us a lot of superficial signals. You didn't get written up in this fancy publication. You didn't get that level of funding. You only raised money from this investor. The reality though of it is that it's always that journey you have to be on, and you have to kind of receive where the world was willing to give you and the universe was able to co-create with you. And you can't be entitled to believe that, while you might be ambitious, that you were guaranteed it. And at the same time, you can't expect everyone to know how to meet you where you are because they haven't walked a mile in your shoes, let alone, as this wonderful UX researcher, Veda Sampson, would say, taking your shoes off to walk that mile. And I think that's just a disconnect we're going to have. But what that defaults to is, if you're listening to this, that it's on you to find your practice, right? No one's going to inherit or give you or mandate something that's going to truly meet you where you are. And if you want, by whatever metaphor, your soul to be fulfilled, your body to find purpose every day, and to manifest that intrinsic and organic motivation that we all crave so much in a dopamine addicted world, like, you're going to have to accept the responsibility that you are going to choose how you act. And, that to me is the punctuation point for welcoming, right? There's so much to receive, and it's so simple to understand. But at the end of the day, like, you choose to be a victim in this moment, or you choose to be the single biggest investment vehicle of the universe. And that's what entrepreneurship is, because you saw what you wanted to fix. You made a plan to have that kind of impact on the world, whether it is working in healthcare or retail or in the creative or industrial arts, let alone things like mental health or education. And you're doing it. But in order to do that, right, you have to be hydrated. And the misconception about entrepreneurship is you're fed toxic positivity. And that is the reason why we have so much churnout and so much kind of stagnant privilege and sort of authority that never goes away, right? Because we don't see below that surface. Because the real beautiful art of entrepreneurship is doing, to failing as little as possible and receiving that failure as an accelerant, right, in order to get to where you need to go.
I love that. Failing as an accelerant. I absolutely love that. That's wonderful. So you gave us a couple of fantastic book recommendations as you were talking. You talked about People of the Lie and 59 Seconds. Is there any other favorite mindfulness resource that you would want to share with folks?
Sure. So I will say that, there's a couple of things that are good mental model building. So one is something called Never Split the Difference. It's another book. It has a bit of a sales connotation, but here's the interesting thing. The gentleman that wrote the book, who I don't want to steal all of his thunder because he's brilliant, really was in a position where he was negotiating in hostage dynamics, right? So you can't receive 80% back of the item in discussion, right, and consider it a success. So it's a pretty binary outcome. And what that means is you have to receive an exorbitant amount of welcoming, really graphic, gruesome, intense kind of frustration, and be able to kind of turn that. And so I don't want to give away all of his secrets. It'd be a great book for everyone to read on the phone. It's been as successful in my recommendations to artists as it has to, like, software architects along the journey, which I think is really important. There's another book I think is really also interesting called King, Warrior, Magician, and Lover. And it's what psychiatrists admittedly recommend to other psychiatrists, but it talks about, even though this is a very male dominant point, I was given it to as a coachable moment because, men can age without maturing, right? And so bringing kind of boy energy into kind of manhood is a topic that is probably, at the risk of stating the obvious, particularly under discussed. But, these four kind of dimensions of your ego and how you represent, and kind of how to identify kind of boy versus kind of more mature energy by whatever metaphor you want to do is really important. And I think that's there. I think, Susan Cain's Quiet, is a reflection on, what is the power of introversion and kind of character-based leadership as opposed to extroversion and kind of material-based, leadership as well. And I think in this window of welcoming, I think it's important to realize that you don't have to be verbally gladiating in order to achieve significant deep outcomes, in a modern world, but you do need to be able to welcome a lot of that dysfunctional extroversion in if you're an omnivore or an introvert, right, along that journey. And then the last book recommendation I promise I'll make, because this is one is so close to my soul, is something called The Coddling of the American Mind. And it's written by a First Amendment attorney and a cognitive behavioral therapist, if you can imagine that dynamic duo, or bad, who walks into a bar joke. The idea, though, is, we have come into a place in balance of this incredible welcoming where we have over-indexed on the idea, in my view, of safety at times. So being challenged, right? Being critiqued, being told that it was not something that met an established criteria or quality standard is not the same as receiving an attack or giving an attack. And, I want to kind of balance some of the thoughtful kind of pathways and dialogue we were walking everybody through to say, hey, at the end of the day, the other side of welcoming is not an expectation that people need to submit to your lowest state of self-acceptance. And that's an important kind of moment, because I can't ask you, Stephanie, to make yourself smaller because I feel small. Therefore, you need to be able to give, and I need to be able to receive that kind of challenging, personal, and directed feedback in order to bring all of this to life. And so I really, if I was going to start with any of those books, The Coddling of the American Mind is probably the most honest reality of how welcoming has to be nuanced for entrepreneurship, as opposed to sort of in your kind of parent, caregiver, dependent dynamics, in a personal construct.
Those are all amazing recommendations. I wanna wrap it up to respect our time together. So last question, is there anything I didn't ask about or that you had hoped to share that we didn't touch on?
Maybe just for a couple of minutes at the end here is to talk about this wonderful, messy buzziness of artificial intelligence. And in many ways, whether you were thinking it or not, most subconsciouses that were listening to this dialogue were thinking in terms of a human context, right? The intelligence, emotional, mental, and physical, otherwise, that humans interact. Well, it turns out that robots also have forms of intelligence, right? In fact, the only type of intelligence we have not yet achieved is kind of that interpersonal intelligence. So, of the kind of mythical eight, one is sort of the last regard or frontier yet conquered. And what that means is, concepts of kind of, like guilt and shame and those type of dynamics, for good and bad, that they teach us, right? As all emotions do, have not yet been trunched. But, we are embracing an era where artificial intelligence, by any name, alternative intelligence, augmented AI, assisted AI, whatever the buzziness comes out before we yell bingo is going to be, is that we are all going to be met by objects and artifacts and systems that increasingly represent interactions that are really similar to the type of interactions we have with human. And, on one side, listen, hey, the good news is they joke at Carnegie Mellon, where I also teach sometimes, robots can barely open doorknobs today. So I don't know if we're like on the sort of doom seed yet, but what is important is, there's a lot of activities that we're going to welcome artificial intelligence into our life. So I work on an organization, a company that only works on ethical persuasion and influence around products and services. There is a lot to sort of unpack about how we train models in a receptive way and eliminate bias and mitigate all of that. But there's, more importantly, what happens when, instead of hiring a human colleague, you hire an AI colleague, right? And that AI colleague actually takes the inbound messages or responds to the notes, or, organizes the spreadsheet or whatever it is, and sort of how are we going to welcome that? And so, I just want to kind of kick off the topic of welcoming kind of this humanity-centered design as opposed to human-centered design era that we're coming into. It is upon us, and you're going to need skills to embrace the complicated, weirdly sci-fi moment of what happens when Siri, Alexa, or Google Home become more interactive. What happens when, the tab that you have open for various what they call large language models or chat experiences today becomes embedded in everything you do and passively just facilitates and listens to you. And I think we need to sort of make space for that, to kind of consider and explore. And I would coach everybody, despite all those kind of elevator operator vibes that we're getting, like the world is kind of superseding us right now, to kind of embrace this moment and say, like, how can I benefit, right? How can we make hay while the sun is shining? How do the lemons become lemonade? And then on a positive note, wow, for the first time, how can I take this equity enabler, right? This shortcut, and really push forward with it. So, maybe a topic for another day to talk about all the kind of data and research we have around how people are reacting and doing and exploring their practice with artificial intelligence and different types of kind of robotic or kind of digital environments. But I think it's a really important and wonderful moment that we talk about, because I would say 90% of the workshops I do right now with the AI that I develop is about how to do change management with human colleagues when artificial intelligence is sort of descending upon it. Like, what does that look like, and how to receive that and manage your ego, your identity, and your concept of self-worth, even though it feels like everything is a new formula and a new equation that we haven't historically been ready for.
Thank you for that. I think it's really important that you brought up equity when we're talking about this, because a lot of times technology is not equally shared, right? So I appreciate that you named that. And I also appreciate that you named how difficult change is, and to work with holding change, living change,
That's
all of
right.
the things. So like, I feel like ending on that as a kind of cliffhanger for welcoming is a really great spot, because we could just invite anyone listening to think about, how do you welcome change? And the biggest change happening right now in society with AI, right? How things are all changing. I have an elderly mom, and I know, gosh, talking to the TV for her, that's kind of crazy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. I mean, and before that, it was, sort of seeing it in color, and then it was seeing it all, and then it was hearing it for the first time when you weren't
Yep,
together. And
yep,
it's interesting, right? We're also on this cusp of, my final thought here about other things we would welcome is, Apple just came out with its Vision Pro, which if you
yep,
haven't seen it yet, for those that are listening, it looks like really fancy ski goggles that are kind of connected to a battery pack that allow you to have a mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality mix up in this kind of extension of experiences. And, I actually joked that I'm not sure it's of the same magnitude necessarily. We'll see, of inherently the kind of mobile phone coming around. But if you think about, the other side, right, that's a whole different set of big enabler that's becoming ubiquitous. And so, as we think about the role of technology, at least the way we think about it, both the hardware and software is actually going to be more of where your personal welcoming goes, as all the automation in the background begins to do things like organize your bills and go grocery shopping for you, and a variety of other ways that are here. So, lots to unpack here, but I just wanted to say, Stephanie, how much I appreciate the opportunity to sort of share the venture back kind of high tech, high growth kind of point of view on this. I'm excited to learn from other comments and questions and reactions that people have to this, and I'll be following along the rest of the framework to understand what comes, following this welcoming moment.
Thank you so much for joining, Adam, and I've so enjoyed getting to know you a little bit better. We've kind of interacted in a couple of different ways, and this has just been a wonderful deeper dive into getting to know you, and made my heart happy. So thanks for joining.
Of course. Always, that's our goal as entrepreneurs, right? Is to try to lift up some of what's going wrong in the world.
Yeah, thanks.
Say Something Studio.